All right, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to take a second and really think back to your own classroom experiences. Picture the rows of desks, getting that fresh syllabus handed to you on day one, staring at those completely rigid rules and expectations. For most of us, this just felt like the natural order of things, right? Well, today we are going to gear up for a pretty major paradigm shift in how courses are actually built. We're unpacking Lesson 6 from our source material, Needs versus Rights Analysis. We're going to explore exactly how educational systems figure out what you supposedly need, and honestly, much more importantly, what rights you actually have to negotiate those learning conditions and challenge the requirements. So be honest, have you ever felt maybe just a little bit like a totally compliant subject in a classroom? Think about those times you felt just completely overwhelmed by nonstop rapid fire lectures, or when you felt totally disconnected from this massive, mandatory textbook that costs $200 and literally puts you to sleep by page 3. Well, you absolutely aren't alone. Educational researchers have been looking closely at this exact dynamic. Our source material really digs into this feeling, asking a huge question. Are students just empty vessels meant to passively absorb information, or is there a much more active role we can and, for sure, should be playing? Because the core realization here is actually quite simple, but it's a game changer. Syllabuses are not handed down from the heavens. That formal piece of paper you get on the very first day of class, it isn't just some universally true, perfectly objective document. It is meticulously constructed by people. And it's built based on a very specific framework of decisions regarding what someone else deems important for you to know and exactly how they expect you to learn it. So you might be wondering, how do they actually build that syllabus? Well, they use something called needs analysis. In the academic sources, needs analysis is defined as the techniques used for collecting and assessing information to design a course. Basically, it's the foundational tool educators use to figure out the how and the what of a curriculum. It pulls together a huge umbrella of data, looking at your goals, your background, your current proficiencies, and the real-world situations where you'll eventually need to use this knowledge. To make this concrete, let's look at how course designers map it all out. They usually split things into two main buckets, the present situation and the target situation. The present situation is basically your starting line, who you are, your preferred learning styles, your current skills. Then you've got the target situation. That's the ultimate finish line. Like, why do you need this specific knowledge? Are you trying to pass a massive exam? Will you be presenting to experts in a specific field? By plotting out the why, how, and who across these two situations, teachers are trying to build a bridge from where you are right now to where the institution needs you to be tomorrow. Okay, but here comes the plot twist. The source material points out something it calls the illusion of impartiality. See, needs analysis is often presented as this super precise, objective, almost scientific educational technology, right? But that actually creates a totally misleading sense of impartiality. It makes it seem like teachers can just look at some data and scientifically read off the perfect course. In reality, a needs analysis creates a set of learning goals that inherently brings the teacher's own personal values, beliefs, and teaching philosophies right into the mix. Researchers Dudley Evans and St. John really hit the nail on the head here. They state that needs analysis is influenced by the ideological preconceptions of the analyst. Think about what that actually means. Defining a student's need as something purely measurable is, in itself, an ideological stance. Because what the school administrators think you need, what your subject tutors think you need, and what you actually want for yourself can be wildly different things. Choosing what to teach isn't just a neutral professional checkbox. It fundamentally involves authority and power. So let's compare. Traditional needs analysis usually looks at the academic experience strictly from the institution's perspective. It pretty much assumes student compliance and just describes what is expected of you. But enter researcher Sarah Benish. She introduces this concept called rights analysis, and it completely flips the script. Rights analysis theorizes students as active participants, not just compliant little subjects. It actively highlights those power relations and takes a critical approach to the classroom, questioning the results of a standard needs analysis to try and build a much more democratic, participatory environment. To really wrap our heads around this, let's look at an absolutely fascinating study Benish ran, which is detailed in our sources. She actually conducted a rights analysis by pairing an English for academic purposes course with a massive university psychology lecture. So half of the 45 students in this psych class were immigrant students who were also in Benish's English class. She sat in, audio taped the psychology lectures, took notes, and recorded the students' reactions. She wanted to see exactly how power was being exercised and resisted in that specific room. Now, initially, when you looked at this psychology course through the traditional lens of a needs analysis, the findings were, well, pretty dry. It yielded a very limited, standard set of expected activities. According to the institution, the students needed to listen to lectures, take notes, read a huge textbook, and study for multiple choice exams. These were just the baseline skills they supposedly required to survive and comply with the course demands. But Benish looked deeper. She took a political perspective on what was actually happening in that lecture hall. And she noticed a dynamic she called coverage is control. The professor was so incredibly focused on covering just massive amounts of material that the whole learning process was entirely regulated by this relentless, textbook-driven lecturing. Think about it. If students are spending 100% of their energy just trying to keep their heads above water, memorizing facts, reading endlessly, there is literally zero time for them to challenge the status quo or connect what they're learning to larger social issues. Relentless lecturing, it turns out, is a super effective form of institutional control. But here's where it gets really good. The students didn't just quietly sit there and take it. And this perfectly illustrates the heart of rights analysis. They pushed back. They voiced their complaints, they got super engaged in class discussions, and they submitted written responses in Benish's paired English class. But the absolute best, most remarkable tactic they used was right there in the psychology lecture itself. They started raising their hands and using questions, not just to understand the material, but to intentionally, strategically slow down the nonstop pace of the lecture. By actively questioning the professor and pumping the brakes on that fire hose of information, the entire dynamic of the classroom transformed. The source text actually describes rights analysis as recognizing the classroom as a site of struggle. The simple act of questioning became an active negotiation over who actually controlled the discourse and who controlled the time. It was an amazing way for the students to resist being passive receivers and demand to be treated as legitimate, active members of the class. So, how do we actually resolve this tug of war between institutional control and student rights? Well, the literature points us toward an awesome solution: adopting a negotiated syllabus. This is a setup where the actual content of a course is open for discussion between the teacher and the students. It builds a real sense of community, allowing learners to exercise their agency instead of just swallowing a prepackaged cookie-cutter curriculum. In fact, researchers Breen and Littlejohn, who are cited in our text, map out 4 specific areas that can totally be up for negotiation. First up, purposes, deciding together which immediate and long-term learning goals to actually focus on. Second is content, meaning what topics, themes, and genres the class is going to cover. Third, ways of working, hashing out the resources, the tasks, and finding that sweet spot between in-class and out-of-class workload. And finally, evaluation, literally negotiating what the outcomes should look like and exactly how you're going to be graded. So, what does this all mean for you? The source material actually gives us some fantastic, highly actionable advice on how to stop acting like a blank slate. The biggest takeaway? Take the initiative. Seriously, do not sit around waiting for your teachers to ask for your input. Ask relevant questions. Bring your own relevant material into the classroom. Propose alternative ideas and ask your tutor what they think. Remember, you have the fundamental right to help shape your own educational environment. Sarah Benish drops this incredibly powerful line that reminds us of the stakes here. She writes, "If we do not make students aware of these kinds of choices, we are choosing compliance for them." It's so true. Balancing the institutional expectations of a needs analysis with the empowering possibilities of a rights analysis gives you the power to choose what you accept and what you challenge. Because without that awareness, silence is just compliance. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought directly from the text. How far is it the teacher's job to actually encourage learners to engage with the sociopolitical aspects of their learning? And honestly, the bigger question is for you watching. Moving forward, are you going to choose passive compliance, or will you exercise your rights and actively engage in shaping your own learning? It is a massive shift in how we view education, and one that is absolutely worth negotiating.